Rahul stumbled out of the club, his mind foggy with booze and the pulsing beat of the latest techno DJ. He sauntered down the streets of Horsecast Village, basking in the glow of the city's consumerist utopia. The darkness of the night didn't faze him. He was invincible, untouchable, a god amongst men. He had no luck with the ladies that night, but that didn't matter. He had something better, a car and a dark, deserted road. He headed towards Vasant Kunj, through a back road that wound its way through the old, forested areas. No cops, no checkpoints, just him, his car, and the open road. But as he turned onto the back road, he felt a shiver run down his spine. The darkness seemed thicker here, more oppressive, and there were no street lights to guide his way. The road was desolate, the trees looming like sentinels on either side. And that's when he saw her, an old woman in a white sari, standing on the side of the road. Her hand was outstretched, as if beckoning him. Rahul felt his heart race, but he ignored her, accelerating past her without a second glance. But she was persistent. A few minutes later, he saw her again, farther down the road, still begging for a ride. Rahul could not believe it. How had she moved so fast? He swerved to avoid her and sped off, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. And then he saw her again, this time in the middle of the road. Her arms were outstretched, her mouth open in a silent scream. Rahul felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This wasn't right. This wasn't human. He swerved again, narrowly missing the old woman. And that's when he saw it. The main road, just up ahead. Relief flooded through him, and he put his foot down, accelerating towards safety. But it was a false hope. In his side mirror, he saw the old woman running beside his car, keeping pace with him. Rahul couldn't believe it. Was he hallucinating? He looked out his left window, and there she was again. Her eyes sunken, her face pale, her hair matted. And she was screaming, a sound that chilled him to the bone. Rahul swerved onto the main Delhi highway, finally free of the back road from hell. But his relief was short-lived. As soon as he thought he was safe, he felt a presence beside him, a cold breath on his neck. He turned to look, and there she was, the old woman, sitting in the passenger seat, laughing hysterically. Her laugh was inhuman, a sound that made Rahul's blood run cold. He swerved again, his heart racing, but it was too late. The car slammed into the divider at 100 miles per hour, flipping over and over, crushing Rahul's body beyond recognition. The next morning, they found the car wreckage and Rahul's corpse on the side of the highway. The police chalked it up to drunken driving, but those who knew the truth whispered of the back road from hell and the old woman in the white sari who haunted it. And they say that if you drive down that road at night, you can still hear laughter, a sound that will make you question your sanity and your very existence. The old woman in the white sari, a ghostly reminder of the horrors that lurk in the darkness. Raj had always been a solitary soul, a loner from the moment he took his first breath. The mere act of speaking to another human being would cause his body to seize up, leaving him drenched in a cold sweat. But little did he know that fate had something special in store for him. It was at a funeral that Raj's world changed forever. While his family mourned the loss of their loved one, Raj found himself speaking to a random gravestone. As if by magic, the grave spoke back to him, and Raj felt a warmth that he had never felt before. The voice belonged to Mr. Smith, the occupant of the grave, and before long, the two became fast friends. Raj's visits to the graveyard became more frequent, and his bond with Mr. Smith grew stronger with each passing day. Some would say he was losing his mind, but Raj knew that his friendship with the spirit was real. For the first time in his life, he had found a friend who accepted him for who he was. One night, Raj's curiosity got the better of him. He arrived at the graveyard with a shovel and began to dig up Mr. Smith's grave. Hours passed as he toiled away, but finally he knocked on the wood of the coffin. With trembling hands, he opened the lid and gazed upon his friend's ancient skeletal remains. The bones twisted and contorted, frozen in an eternal scream. Overcome with emotion, Raj climbed into the grave and hugged Mr. Smith's bones tightly. Exhausted from his labor, he soon drifted off to sleep, cradled in the arms of his newfound companion. The next morning, the caretaker arrived at the graveyard, still groggy from a night of drinking. To his horror, he found that one of the graves had been dug up. Oblivious to the fact that Raj was still inside, the caretaker closed the coffin lid and began pouring dirt into the grave. As the dirt rained down on him, Raj's voice froze up, leaving him unable to scream for help. Trapped inside the coffin, he felt his life slipping away. In his final moments, he realized that his quest for companionship had led him down a dark and lonely path. Sanjay trudged his way back from work, his mind heavy with the weight of 1,000 worries. It wasn't until he was halfway through his journey that he began to feel like he was being followed. He glanced over his shoulder but saw no one, yet the feeling persisted. Then the weather began to turn. The winds picked up, howling like a pack of ravenous wolves. The sky, once clear and blue, became dark and overcast. A chill ran down his spine, and he quickened his pace, hoping to make it home before the storm hit. But he wasn't so lucky. The fog descended upon him like a shroud, thick and impenetrable. He could barely see his hand in front of his face, let alone the path he was supposed to be following. Panic set in as he realized he was lost and alone, trapped in a nightmare. It was then that the whispers began. At first, they were barely audible, a faint murmur in the back of his mind, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they were practically screaming in his ears. "Do you remember?" they asked. "Do you remember?" Sanjay did remember. He remembered all too well. 30 years ago, he had made a terrible mistake. Drunk and foolish, he had gotten behind the wheel of his car and careened down the road, oblivious to the world around him. In a moment of sheer stupidity, he had collided with a motorcycle, killing the man, his wife, and their child. Sanjay had fled the scene, never looking back. Now, 3 decades later, Sanjay had it all. A successful engineering career, a sprawling estate, and all the riches he could ask for. But on this night, fate had come back to claim him. The fog was no ordinary mist. It was a haunting, a ghostly reminder of his past. The ghosts of his victims had come back to haunt him. He could feel them all around him, their icy fingers reaching out to drag him down into the abyss. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but his voice was gone. And then he felt it, a sharp pain in his stomach, like a knife plunging deep into his flesh. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath as he realized he had been stabbed by an invisible force from beyond the grave. As his life's blood seeped out of him, he heard the whispers one last time. "Remember us," they said. "Remember us. Now it's your time to join us." Sanjay's vision grew dim as he felt the icy fingers of death wrap around him. The ghosts of the past had come back to claim their final revenge. Maggie had never met her grandfather, and she had never wanted to. Her mother had always spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones as if he was some sort of monster. But when Maggie received a letter from a lawyer telling her that she had been named in her grandfather's will, she couldn't resist the temptation to learn more about the man who had always been a mystery to her. The will was strange, to say the least. It stipulated that Maggie would only inherit her grandfather's considerable fortune if she agreed to sell her soul to the devil. At first, Maggie dismissed the idea as a prank, but the more she dug into her grandfather's past, the more convinced she became that it was all true. As Maggie delved deeper, she began to uncover a web of secrets and lies. Her grandfather had been a powerful man, feared and respected in equal measure. But he had also been a cruel and vindictive man. Maggie learned that he had made a deal with the devil, exchanging his own soul for power and wealth beyond his wildest dreams. But as Maggie struggled with the decision of whether to accept the inheritance, she began to notice strange things happening around her. Shadows seemed to move on their own. Whispers echoed through the halls of her mansion, and the air grew thick with a sense of malevolence. Finally, Maggie made her decision. She would sell her soul to the devil and claim her inheritance. She signed the contract, feeling a sense of unease that she couldn't quite shake. As she settled into her new life of luxury and decadence, Maggie began to experience strange, disturbing dreams. She saw her grandfather, or something that looked like him, beckoning her to join him in the depths of hell. And then, one night, she woke to find him standing at the foot of her bed. His eyes were black pits, his skin was ashen, and his voice was a cold, hollow whisper. "Maggie," he said, "you thought you could outsmart me, but you were wrong. You were never meant to inherit my fortune. You were only ever meant to join me in hell." Maggie tried to scream, but her voice was silenced by a hand that seemed to come from nowhere. And then, in a flash of fire and brimstone, her grandfather was gone. As Maggie lay there, trembling and alone, she realized the terrible truth. Her inheritance had never been about money or power. It had been about indoctrination. Her grandfather had wanted to create a vessel for the devil, a body that he could inhabit and use to wreak havoc on the world. She soon noticed that her body was twisted and contorted. Her skin was blistered and burnt, and her eyes glowed with an otherworldly light. The devil had taken possession of her body, using it as a vessel for his own twisted desires. He reveled in the pain and suffering he caused, delighting in the terror he instilled in those around him. And Maggie was trapped, a prisoner in her own body, forced to watch as the devil used her to carry out his evil deeds. In the end, there was no redemption for Maggie. She was consumed by the darkness, consumed by the devil himself, and her soul was lost forever. She had sold her soul for nothing, and doing so had condemned herself to an eternity of torment and pain. Jaya stood on the balcony of her high-rise apartment, gazing out at the bustling city below. It was a cold autumn evening, and the air was tinged with the scent of fallen leaves. She glanced at the neighboring apartment, where an old woman named Mrs. Patel lived alone. Mrs. Patel was a mysterious figure in the building, rarely seen outside of her dimly lit home. However, she frequently visited Jaya, bearing gifts of cakes and food. The food always looked a little off, with a musty odor that made Jaya's stomach churn. She politely accepted the offerings but never dared to take a bite. One stormy evening, a knock echoed through Jaya's apartment. Reluctantly, she opened the door to find Mrs. Patel standing there, her eyes filled with a sinister glint. I thought we could have tea together tonight, the old woman said, her voice dripping with an otherworldly tone. Jaya's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't resist the old woman's forceful invitation. Paralyzed with fear, she led Mrs. Patel into her living room, where the tea sat waiting. The room grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over them. As they sipped their tea, Jaya felt a surge of fear course through her veins. She realized too late that Mrs. Patel had placed her under a spell. Her body became rigid, unable to move or scream for help. The room warped and twisted, and Jaya watched in horror as Mrs. Patel's skin began to fall off, revealing a grotesque, otherworldly form beneath. With each moment that passed, the demon crawled out of Mrs. Patel's decaying body and into Jaya's. The pain was excruciating, as if her very soul was being torn apart. She wanted to beg for mercy, but her lips were sealed shut. All she could do was watch as the demon completed its unholy possession. Finally, Mrs. Patel collapsed inanimate and dead on the floor, her body a vessel drained of life. Jaya, now under the complete control of the demon, silently carried the old woman's lifeless form back to her apartment, tucking her into bed. No one suspected foul play, for they believed that Mrs. Patel had died of natural causes. From that day forward, Jaya's life became a twisted charade. The demon possessed her every thought and action, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the human form would wither away. Friends and family saw no signs of the dark presence that had taken hold of her. But in the dead of night, Jaya would revel in the darkness, feeding the demon's numerous desires. Days turned into years, and Jaya grew old, her body frail and feeble. The demon, however, thrived within her, biding its time until the day it would need a new body to inhabit, and the search for its next victim was on.